In 1899, a German architect named Robert Koldewey stood on a mound of sand and broken brick 90 kilometers south of Baghdad, and beneath his feet lay the largest city the ancient world had ever built, a city whose walls had once stretched more than 18 kilometers around 250,000 souls, a city that had been buried so completely that for centuries scholars debated whether it had existed at all outside the pages of Scripture. This is Babylon, and the question that drives everything you are about to witness is deceptively simple. How did a patch of flat, defenseless alluvial mud beside a shifting river become the most powerful city on earth, and why did the earth swallow it whole? What follows is not a fragment. This is the complete story, from the first settlement traces in the late 3rd millennium before Christ to the last cuneiform tablet scratched in the 1st century of our era, and beyond, to the moment the glazed blue bricks of the Ishtar Gate emerged from the soil after 2,500 years of silence. You will witness the founding, when Amorite chieftains raised the first mud brick walls and dedicated a modest shrine to a god named Marduk, who would one day rule the Mesopotamian pantheon. You will walk through the reign of Hammurabi, who carved 282 laws into black diorite and engineered canals that turned the plain into the richest farmland between the Mediterranean and the mountains of Iran. You will see the city sacked by Hittite raiders, rebuilt by Kassite kings across 4 quiet centuries, crushed under Assyrian boots and drowned by Sennacherib's deliberate flooding. Then you will witness the resurrection, when Nabopolassar and his son Nebuchadnezzar II raised Babylon to a height no city on earth could match. 7 staged ziggurats, processional avenues paved in white limestone, gates sheathed in lapis-colored glaze, where golden dragons caught the desert sun. You will enter the homes of scribes and brewers, watch astronomers chart the movements of planets with naked-eye precision that would not be surpassed for 1,000 years, and stand in the temple of Esagila as priests recited the creation epic on the night the world was made new. And then you will see the fall, the Persian army at the gates, the slow drain of life under Seleucid rule, Alexander dying in the palace he meant to make his capital, and finally the sand, rising year by year until nothing remained but shapeless mounds and a name that echoed through every civilization that came after. This matters because Babylon is not merely old, it is foundational. The concept of written law applied equally to rich and poor, the idea that a city could be planned and zoned and administered, the astronomical observations that gave us the 60-minute hour and the 360-degree circle, the very notion that a single city could stand as the center of the known world. All of these were born here, in sun-dried brick and bitumen mortar, beside a river that no longer flows where it once did. For centuries, Babylon existed only as a warning in sacred texts and a legend in Greek histories. Its rediscovery proved that the legend was, if anything, too modest. The real city was grander than the myth. If you find yourself drawn to complete journeys through the great cities of the ancient world, subscribe to this channel. Each week, we resurrect a civilization from the dust, brick by brick, life by life, in the fullest detail the evidence allows. Now let us begin where every city begins, with the ground itself, the river, and the first people who looked at this flat and featureless plain and saw the possibility of everything. Long before any city rises, there is only the land, and here The land is flat beyond comprehension, a vast alluvial plain stretching from horizon to horizon, built grain by grain over millennia by the slow patience of rivers. The Euphrates descends from the Armenian highlands, carrying silt torn from volcanic rock and limestone, and deposits it across southern Mesopotamia in layers so deep that bedrock lies buried beneath dozens of meters of accumulated earth. This is not land shaped by mountains or carved by glaciers. It is land made by water, and it belongs to water still. Roughly 90 kilometers south of where modern Baghdad stands, the Euphrates once split into braided channels, fanning across the plain in a network of streams, marshes, and seasonal flood basins. No hill commands the terrain. No natural harbor invites the sea. The ground offers nothing that would seem, to an untrained eye, like a place for a great city. Yet everything about this location is strategic. The branching channels create natural irrigation without massive engineering. The soil, renewed each spring by floodwaters, yields barley and emmer wheat in extraordinary abundance. Date palms crowd the riverbanks. Reed beds provide building material, fuel, and fodder. More than fertility, this ground commands movement. From here, river traffic flows south toward the Persian Gulf and the copper trade of Dilmun. Overland routes run northeast toward the Iranian plateau and its tin, northwest toward Anatolia and its silver, west toward the Levite coast and Egypt. Any settlement planted at this junction of waterways and caravan paths sits at the center of a web connecting every resource the ancient world requires. By the early 3rd millennium before the Common Era, the Sumerian city-states have already proven what this landscape can sustain. Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Lagash, Nippur, they rise on similar ground to the south and east, each built of sun-dried mud brick pressed from the same alluvial clay. Their temples tower on platforms above the floodline. Their granaries feed tens of thousands. Their scribes press reed styluses into wet clay, recording grain yields, temple offerings, and king lists. This is the world into which Babylon will be born. But not yet. The earliest occupation layers beneath Babylon's later monuments remain largely inaccessible. The water table, fed by those same ancient channels, rises so high that Koldewey's excavators could not reach virgin soil. What fragments exist suggest modest settlement from the late 3rd millennium. Mud brick walls, potsherds consistent with the late early dynastic or Akkadian periods. The city called Babilim, the Gate of the Gods, does not yet appear in any surviving text from this era. Nearby Kish, only 15 kilometers to the east, already holds dynastic prestige. Borsippa, visible across the plain to the southwest, maintains its own temple to Nabu. Between these older powers, the site of Babylon waits, a minor settlement on a branch of the Euphrates, unremarkable, unrecorded, its mud brick houses dissolving and rebuilding with the rhythm of floods and generations. The reeds sway along the canal margins. Bitumen seeps from the earth near the riverbed, black and viscous, already used to seal boats and waterproof foundations. Fish crowd the shallows. Flocks of waterfowl darken the marshes at dawn. The air smells of wet clay and river mud, of smoke from dung fires, of the green sweetness of date groves in flower. The plain hums with life, but no great walls yet mark this ground, no ziggurat yet rises against the pale sky. The land simply waits, accumulating silt, season after season, building the platform on which an empire will eventually stand. Sometime around 1894 before the Common Era, a man named Sumuabum raises walls where none had stood before. He is Amorite, descended from the semi-nomadic peoples who drifted eastward from the Syrian steppe across generations, filtering into the settled cities of Mesopotamia, adopting Akkadian script and Sumerian temple customs while retaining their own tribal names and kinship structures. He is not the first to live on this ground beside the Euphrates, but he is the first to claim it as the seat of a dynasty. He builds a wall, and in doing so, he declares that Babylon is no longer a village. It is a city. The wall itself is mud brick, sun-dried blocks of alluvial clay mixed with chopped straw, laid in courses and plastered with river mud. It is modest by the standards of Ur or Nippur, but it defines a perimeter. It says, "This ground is ours, and we will defend it." Inside, the earliest temple platform rises, a low rectangular structure oriented to the cardinal directions, dedicated already to Marduk, a deity still young in the Mesopotamian pantheon, not yet supreme, but claimed by this new dynasty as their divine patron. The shrine is small, its mud-plastered walls barely distinguishable from the houses that cluster around it. But it is the seed of what will become the Esagila, the most sacred precinct in all of Babylonia. Babylon, in this era, is one city among many, and not the greatest. To the south, Isin still claims the legacy of the third dynasty of Ur, its kings styling themselves as heirs to Sumerian kingship. Lhasa controls the rich agricultural lands of the lower plain and the lucrative trade routes running toward the Persian Gulf. To the northeast, Eshnunna commands the Diyala River Valley and access to the Iranian plateau. Each of these cities is older, wealthier, more established. Babylon sits between them, strategically located, yes, but politically vulnerable, a newcomer among ancient powers. The first dynasty endures through a succession of kings whose names survive in later king lists: Sumulael, Sabium, Apil-Sin, Sin-Mubalit. Each adds to the walls, extends the canal network, negotiates or fights with neighbors. The canals are everything. They bring Euphrates water to fields of barley and emmer wheat. They carry boat traffic laden with dates and sesame. They drain the salt that poisons irrigated soil. Controlling a canal head means controlling life itself on this plain. For over a century, Babylon grows slowly, carefully, surrounded by rivals who could crush it. The city's footprint expands along the eastern bank of the river. Houses of mud brick crowd narrow lanes. Small workshops produce textiles and pottery. Scribes trained in cuneiform record land sales, grain loans, temple offerings. The smell of baking bread and brewing beer drifts from courtyard ovens. Date palms line the canal banks, their fronds rustling in the hot wind that sweeps endlessly across the flat land. No great monuments mark this era. No conquests reshape the political map. The city simply persists, building its walls higher after each flood season, deepening its canals, training its scribes, honoring its god. It is a city learning to be a city, accumulating the administrative habits, the priestly traditions, the military discipline that will matter enormously when, at last, a king capable of wielding them all arrives. That king will be the sixth of the dynasty, Sin-Mubalit's son, born into a city still modest, still hemmed by rivals, but no longer fragile. The walls Sumuabum raised a century earlier have held. The temple platform has grown. The canals flow. Babylon is ready. His name is Hammurabi, and he ascends the throne around 1792 before the Common Era, a young king inheriting a city still encircled by stronger powers. Larsa dominates the south. Eshnunna controls the Diyala routes to the east. Elam looms beyond the Zagros. Mari commands the upper Euphrates trade. For nearly 30 years, Hammurabi governs with patience, building alliances through letters written in careful Akkadian on clay tablets. Correspondence recovered from the palace archives at Mari reveals a ruler who calculates, flatters, delays, and waits. When he strikes, the transformation is swift. In his 30th regnal year, he defeats Rim-Sin of Larsa. Within 5 more years, Eshnunna falls, then Mari itself. Its palace burned so thoroughly that the mud-brick walls baked hard, preserving thousands of tablets for archaeologists 3.5 millennia later. By 1750 before the Common Era, Babylon rules from the Persian Gulf marshes to the middle Euphrates. The modest city-state has become the capital of southern Mesopotamia's first unified empire since the 3rd dynasty of Ur. But Hammurabi builds more than an army. He builds water. His canal projects, documented in year names that commemorate each major excavation, redirect Euphrates' flow into new channels, irrigating fields that feed a growing urban population. The canals serve as transport arteries, too, carrying barley and sesame oil on flat-bottomed boats directly to the city's quays. Babylon swells. New residential quarters press against the old walls. At the city's heart, the Esagila temple complex expands. Hammurabi elevates Marduk, once a local deity of modest rank in the Sumerian pantheon, toward supremacy over all Mesopotamian gods. This is theology as statecraft. A supreme god requires a supreme city, and a supreme city demands a supreme king who serves that god. The triangulation is deliberate, and it will endure for over 1,000 years. The law stele stands as the most enduring artifact of this reign. Carved from black diorite, a stone harder than granite, imported from distant quarries, it rises over 2 meters tall. At its crown, a relief depicts Hammurabi receiving authority from the sun god Shamash. Below, 282 laws are inscribed in elegant cuneiform columns covering property, marriage, debt, injury, trade, slavery, and agricultural practice. These are not the earliest laws in Mesopotamian history. Ur-Nammu's code precedes them by 3 centuries, but they are the most comprehensive, the most systematically organized, and the most explicitly public. The stele was meant to be read. It was placed where subjects could approach it, where the king's justice was literally written in stone. The throne room of the palace, modest compared to what Nebuchadnezzar will later construct on the same ground, nonetheless functions as the nerve center of an empire administered through clay. Scribes produce letters, tax records, judicial decisions, canal maintenance orders. The bureaucratic density is remarkable. Babylon under Hammurabi generates more written documentation per decade than most ancient cities produce in centuries. The smell of the city in this era is river water and baking bread, bitumen sealing rooftops against rain, the wet clay of fresh tablets drying in courtyards. Palm-wood beams support ceilings of packed earth. Streets are narrow, unpaved, shadowed by walls of sun-dried brick that rise 2 stories. The temple platform of Esagila, faced with fired brick, catches the first light each morning, a beacon visible from the surrounding plain. Hammurabi dies around 1750 before the Common Era. His empire, built on personal diplomacy and military timing, immediately begins to contract under his son, Samsu-Iluna. Rebellions flare in the south. The Sealand dynasty breaks away. Yet something irreversible has been accomplished. Babylon is no longer one city among many. It is the city, the seat of Marduk, the place where law is carved in stone, the center to which all of southern Mesopotamia now looks. Even when political power fractures, the idea of Babylon as capital persists. Kings who conquer it will claim it rather than destroy it. Empires that rise after it will measure themselves against it. The transformation Hammurabi achieved is not merely territorial, it is conceptual. Babylon has become the name for civilization itself. But the idea of Babylon as capital does not protect it from the slow erosion of power. Samsu-Iluna fights rebellions he cannot fully suppress. His successors, Abi-Eshu, Amiditana, Amisaduqa, Samsu-Ditana, rule a shrinking domain. The southern marshlands slip away entirely. The great canal networks, without centralized maintenance, silt and narrow. Trade revenues decline. The city endures, Marduk's temple still receives offerings, scribes still copy hymns and omens in the Edaba schools. But the empire Hammurabi forged is gone within 2 generations. What remains is the city itself, proud but diminished, its walls still standing above the flat plain. Then, around 1595 before the Common Era, fire comes from an impossible distance. Mursili I, king of the Hittites, marches an army more than 1,000 kilometers down the Euphrates from Anatolia. This is no sustained conquest. It is a lightning raid of extraordinary ambition. The Hittite forces breach Babylon's walls. They plunder the temples. They carry away the statue of Marduk and the wealth of Esagila. The destruction layer in the archaeological record is thin but unmistakable. Ash, collapsed mud brick, abandonment debris. Mursili does not stay. He withdraws northward, leaving behind a political vacuum and a violated city. Into that vacuum step the Kassites. Their origins remain debated, a people from the Zagros highlands, speaking a language unrelated to Sumerian or Akkadian. They appear first as laborers and mercenaries in Babylonian texts of the Old Babylonian period, then gradually as rulers. The transition is not a single dramatic conquest, but a slow infiltration and assumption of power. By the mid-16th century, a Kassite dynasty sits on Babylon's throne, and it will remain there for over 400 years, the longest single dynasty in Mesopotamian history. The Kassite centuries are quiet in the historical record, but this silence is not emptiness. It is stability. The Kassite kings adopt Babylonian culture wholesale. They worship Marduk. They write in Akkadian. They restore temples Mursili's raid damaged. Kurigalzu I builds an entirely new royal city at Dur-Kurigalzu, its ziggurat core still visible today near modern Akar Kuf, a massive tower of mud brick and reed mat layers rising from the plain. Yet Babylon itself remains the spiritual capital, the seat of Marduk, the city whose name legitimizes kingship. The Kassites leave their own distinctive mark on the material record. Kuduru stones. These carved boundary monuments, fashioned from dark diorite or limestone, record royal land grants with elaborate divine symbols, the crescent of Sin, the 8-pointed star of Ishtar, the horned crown of Anu, serpents and scorpions marking cosmic boundaries. They are legal documents and sacred objects simultaneously, placed in temples as witnesses before the gods. International correspondence flourishes. The Amarna letters reveal Kassite Babylon trading gold, lapis lazuli, and horses with Egypt's pharaohs as equals. Diplomatic marriages cross the ancient world. Babylonian becomes the lingua franca of Near Eastern diplomacy. The scribal schools preserve and transmit the literary heritage, the Epic of Gilgamesh, mathematical tables, astronomical observations, copying and standardizing texts that will survive another millennium. But pressure builds from the north. Assyria grows powerful. Tukulti-Ninurta I of Assyria sacks Babylon around 1235 before the Common Era, carrying Marduk's statue away once more, a humiliation that Babylonian chronicles never forget. The Kassites recover, weakened. Then, around 1155, the Elamites under Shutruk-Nahunta sweep in from the east. They take the stele of Hammurabi itself, carrying it to Susa, where French archaeologists will find it nearly 3,000 years later. The last Kassite king falls. The dynasty ends. What remains after these 5 centuries is not ruin, but continuity. The Kassites preserved Babylon's religious identity, its scribal traditions, its temple economies. They maintained the infrastructure of a civilization even when political glory dimmed. The city that emerges from their long stewardship is battered, twice plundered of its patron god's image, yet culturally intact, still the city that other powers must possess to claim legitimacy over the south. The long Kassite twilight was not decline. It was preservation, patient and unglamorous, holding the idea of Babylon together through centuries of quiet until history would demand its greatness again. History demands Babylon's greatness again sooner than anyone expects. Around 1155 before the Common Era, the second dynasty of Isin seizes power from the last fragments of Kassite authority, and within decades produces a king whose single act of defiance will echo through Babylonian memory for centuries. Nebuchadnezzar I, not the famous builder, but his distant predecessor, marches east into Elam around 1125 and recovers the stolen statue of Marduk. The god returns to Esagila. The theological wound inflicted by the Elamite raid is healed. Priests compose new hymns. The Enuma Elish, the great creation epic that places Marduk above all other gods, may reach its final form in this era of restored pride. But pride cannot substitute for power. To the north, Assyria is rising, methodical, militarized, hungry. Tukulti-Ninurta I had already captured Babylon briefly in the 13th century, carrying off sacred texts and royal treasures. Now, across the following centuries, Assyrian kings treat Babylon as a prize to be seized, a vassal to be managed, a problem to be solved. Tiglath-Pileser III installs himself as king of Babylon in 729. Sargon II rules it through proxies. Each arrangement collapses into rebellion because Babylon's priesthood and merchant class refuse permanent subordination. The city's identity is theological. Marduk's city cannot serve Ashur's king, and every generation produces new resistance. The breaking point comes under Sennacherib. Exhausted by repeated Babylonian revolts, he chooses annihilation. In 689 before the Common Era, Assyrian forces breach the walls and unleash systematic destruction on a scale Mesopotamia has rarely seen. Sennacherib's own inscriptions boast of diverting canal water through the ruins, flooding temples and palaces, reducing sacred precincts to swamp. The Esagila complex suffers catastrophic damage. Residential quarters are leveled. The city that had endured Hittite raiders and Elamite plunderers now faces something worse. deliberate erasure by a king who wants Babylon not merely conquered, but unmade. The destruction shocks the ancient world. Even within Assyria, the act is considered sacrilege. When Sennacherib is murdered by his own sons in 681, Babylonian tradition interprets the assassination as divine retribution, Marduk's vengeance reaching into the Assyrian palace itself. His successor Esarhaddon inherits both the Assyrian throne and the guilt. He immediately begins rebuilding Babylon, and his inscriptions frame the project not as imperial generosity, but as cosmic obligation. The gods demanded it. Esarhaddon's building records, preserved on clay cylinders, detail the reconstruction of Esagil's foundations, the relaying of mud brick walls, the re-excavation of silted canals. Fired bricks stamped with his name appear throughout the archaeological layers of this period. He imports cedar from Lebanon, limestone from the western mountains, skilled laborers from across the empire. The work is enormous, methodical, and deeply political. Esarhaddon needs Babylonian legitimacy to secure his southern flank. His son Ashurbanipal continues the restoration, but faces the same intractable problem. Babylon revolts again under Shamash-shum-ukin, Ashurbanipal's own brother, installed as sub-king. The siege that follows, ending around 648, brings famine and fire. Once more the city burns. Once more it is rebuilt. Through all of this, the captures, the floods, the sieges, the restorations, something remarkable persists. The scribal schools continue copying texts. The astronomical observers keep recording celestial events on clay tablets. The temple economies function between catastrophes. Merchants negotiate contracts in courtyards still smelling of ash. Babylon absorbs destruction the way its alluvial soil absorbs floodwater, slowly, completely, and then it grows again. By 626 before the Common Era, Assyria itself is fracturing. A Chaldean general named Nabopolassar rises in the south, claims the Babylonian throne, and turns the empire's own weapon, war, back against its creators. The Assyrian shadow that had darkened Babylon for 5 centuries is about to lift. And when it does, the city will build itself into something the ancient world has never seen. Nabopolassar seizes the throne of Babylon in 626 before the Common Era, and the city exhales. He is Chaldean, from the marshy tribal lands of the deep south, where the Euphrates dissolves into reed beds before reaching the Gulf, and he carries no royal pedigree that Assyria would recognize. But the Babylonian priesthood recognizes him. The temples of Marduk, battered and rebuilt so many times under Assyrian occupation, open their gates. The chronicle tablets record his accession plainly, without apology. Babylon has a king again who answers to no overlord in Nineveh. The first years are brutal. Assyria does not release its grip willingly. Assyrian garrisons still hold cities across northern Babylonia, and Nabopolassar fights a grinding war of liberation, city by city, canal by canal, through the flatlands east of the Tigris and along the middle Euphrates. The Nabopolassar Chronicle, preserved on clay tablets now in the British Museum, records these campaigns with terse precision. Advances, retreats, seasonal pauses when the rivers flood and armies cannot move. There is nothing romantic about it. It is a decade of mud, siege, and attrition. But Assyria is bleeding from multiple wounds. Civil wars between rival claimants to the throne at Nineveh have fractured its military coherence. To the east, the Medes under Kyaxares are pressing down from the Zagros highlands with devastating cavalry. Nabopolassar sees the opportunity and forges an alliance, sealed, according to later tradition, by the marriage of his son Nebuchadnezzar to a Median princess. The two powers coordinate their assault on the Assyrian heartland. In 612 before the Common Era, the combined Babylonian and Median forces reach Nineveh itself, the city that had terrorized the ancient world for 3 centuries, whose palaces held the plundered treasures of Egypt, Elam, and Babylon, falls after a siege of roughly 3 months. The Kosa River, swollen by unusual rains, reportedly breaches the walls. Nineveh burns. The Assyrian king Sin-shar-ishkun perishes in the destruction. The chronicle records the event with a restraint that borders on silence, but the archaeological evidence at Nineveh speaks loudly. Thick ash layers, collapsed palace walls, scattered armor. Remnant Assyrian forces retreat westward to Haran, propped up briefly by Egyptian support. Pharaoh Necho II marches north to aid them. It is on this march that King Josiah of Judah falls at Megiddo, trying to block the Egyptian advance. But Egypt arrives too late to save Assyria. Haran falls in 610. By 605, at the Battle of Carchemish on the upper Euphrates, Nebuchadnezzar, commanding his father's army, shatters the combined Assyrian-Egyptian force. The Assyrian Empire ceases to exist. Nabopolassar does not live to savor the full victory. He dies in 605, the same year as Carchemish, and Nebuchadnezzar races back to Babylon to secure the succession. But the father's work is already monumental. Even during the years of war, Nabopolassar had begun rebuilding. His inscriptions, stamped into bricks that archaeologists still pull from the foundations of Babylon's temples, declare his devotion to Esagila and to Marduk, with an intensity that borders on piety as statecraft. He relays temple floors, reinforces canal walls, begins the restoration of Etemenanki, the great ziggurat whose crumbling stages had stood as a rebuke to every foreign occupier. The city he leaves behind is not yet the Babylon of legend. The Ishtar Gate has not yet risen in its final glazed splendor. The processional way is not yet paved in imported limestone. The double walls do not yet stretch to their full 18-kilometer circuit. But the foundations are laid, literally. Nabopolassar's bricks sit beneath his son's bricks in nearly every major structure Koldewey would later excavate. The father built the platform on which the son would raise a wonder of the ancient world. What matters most is simpler than architecture. For the first time in 5 centuries, Babylon belongs to itself. The temple revenues stay in Babylon. The grain harvests feed Babylonian ambitions. The scribes write in Babylonian hands for Babylonian purposes. The smell of fresh bitumen rises from new foundations along the Euphrates bank, and the sound of construction, the thud of rammed earth, the scrape of brick molds, the chanting of laborers hauling mud brick, fills the air of a city preparing to become the center of everything. Nebuchadnezzar II inherits the throne in 605 before the Common Era, and he inherits his father's ambition made manifest in wet mortar and half-finished foundations. But where Nabopolassar laid platforms, the son raises a city that will stagger the ancient world. Over 43 years of reign, Babylon transforms from a recovering capital into the largest, most deliberately constructed urban organism on Earth. The walls come first, because empire demands enclosure. The inner wall, Imga Enlil, runs roughly 6.5 kilometers around the eastern city, built of mud brick 7 meters thick, faced with baked brick set in bitumen. Outside it stands a second wall, Nimiti Enlil, adding another layer of defense with a moat fed by Euphrates water running between them. But Nebuchadnezzar is not satisfied. He extends an outer wall far to the east and north, creating a triangular defensive perimeter stretching over 18 kilometers, large enough to shelter the population of surrounding villages in time of siege. No city in the known world possesses fortifications of this scale. The baked bricks carry stamped inscriptions naming the king, pressed into clay before firing, thousands upon thousands of them, a signature repeated across every course. Through these walls pierce 8 gates, each named for a deity. The grandest faces north. The Ishtar Gate rises 12 meters high, its facade covered entirely in glazed bricks of deep lapis blue. Across this shimmering surface march rows of animals in molded relief, golden-brown aurochs, symbols of the storm god Adad, alternating with mushushu dragons, serpent-necked, lion-footed, sacred to Marduk himself. The glaze catches the Mesopotamian sun and throws it back in colors no mud brick city has ever worn before. Beyond the gate, the processional way extends southward toward the temple quarter. Its pavement consists of limestone slabs over 1 meter square, their undersides inscribed with dedications invisible to every foot that passes above. Walls of glazed brick flank the avenue, decorated with 60 striding lions in yellow, white, and brown against that same impossible blue. The roadway is wide enough for the Akitu festival procession, for the god's statue carried on the shoulders of priests, for the king walking humbled before Marduk. At the city's heart, Etemenanki rises. The great ziggurat, its name meaning the foundation of heaven and earth, stands on a base measuring 91 meters on each side. 7 stages of mud brick ascend toward a high temple sheathed in blue glazed brick. Building inscriptions record Nebuchadnezzar completing what Nabopolassar began, raising the structure to rival heaven. Beside it, the Esagila temple houses Marduk's cult statue in a chamber whose walls gleam with gold leaf and cedar paneling brought from Lebanon. South of the processional way stands the southern palace, the king's primary residence. Its throne room facade bears glazed brick decoration, columns and palmettes in blue, yellow, and white against dark backgrounds. 5 courtyards organize administrative, ceremonial, and private functions. To the north, a second palace complex anchors the city's defenses near the Ishtar Gate, its massive walls doubling as fortification. The Euphrates flows through the city's center, bridged by stone piers that Herodotus would later describe. Quays line both banks, canals branch into residential quarters, carrying water for gardens, workshops, and the daily needs of a population that may reach 200,000 souls. Every surface is deliberate, every brick is stamped, every gate, wall, and temple carries inscriptions declaring that Nebuchadnezzar built this for Marduk, for Babylon, for eternity. The smell of kiln smoke hangs permanently over the city. The firing never stops, because the building never stops. Babylon at its zenith is not merely inhabited. It is perpetually under construction, perpetually becoming more of itself, a city convinced it is the center of creation and building the evidence to prove it. And once each year, the city reveals its deepest purpose. Babylon is not merely an administrative capital or a commercial hub. It is the axis of the cosmos, the place where heaven and earth were joined at creation, and the Akitu festival is the annual proof. The ceremony begins in the month of Nisanu, the first month of the Babylonian calendar, corresponding roughly to the spring equinox. For 12 days, Babylon transforms from a city of commerce and governance into a sacred theatre, where the fate of the world is ritually renewed. The root of this renewal is the processional way itself, not merely a grand avenue but a liturgical instrument built in stone and glazed brick, every surface calibrated to amplify the presence of Marduk. The way runs north to south from the Ishtar Gate toward the Esagila temple complex, paved with slabs of white limestone and red breccia, each stone inscribed on its underside with Nebuchadnezzar's dedication. The walls flanking the avenue rise over 12 meters, faced with glazed bricks in deep lapis blue, bearing 60 molded lions in striding relief, symbols of Ishtar, their manes rendered in yellow and white glaze, their muscles taut with frozen motion. The avenue is roughly 20 meters wide, broad enough for the procession that will fill it. On the second day of Akitu, priests within the Esagila recite the Enuma Elish in its entirety, the Babylonian creation epic in which Marduk slays the chaos dragon Tiamat, fashions the heavens from her body, and establishes Babylon as the first city, built by the gods themselves. The recitation is not entertainment, it is cosmological maintenance. By speaking the words, the priests reenact the ordering of the universe. On the 5th day, the king enters the Esagila. The high priest strips him of his royal insignia, crown, scepter, ring, and mace. The king kneels before Marduk's golden statue. The priest strikes the king's cheek. The king declares that he has not sinned against Babylon, has not neglected the temple, has not struck the privileged. Only then are his regalia restored. This ritual humiliation is not symbolic weakness. It is the annual renegotiation of kingship itself. The throne belongs to Marduk, and the king holds it only by divine consent renewed each Nisanu. Marduk's statue, seated in the inner cellar of the Esagila, is gold. Ancient texts describe it with awe, though no trace of it survives. The Esagila tablet, a mathematical text preserved in later copies, records the temple's dimensions with extraordinary precision, chamber by chamber. Beside the Esagila rises Etemenanki, the ziggurat whose base measures 91 meters on each side, its 7 stages ascending toward a summit shrine clad in blue-glazed brick. Classical sources claim it reached the height of 90 meters, though this remains debated. Its name means the foundation of heaven and earth. During the festival's later days, Marduk's statue is carried from the Esagila northward through the Ishtar Gate to the Akitu House, a temple outside the city walls set amid canal-fed gardens. The procession moves slowly. Priests in linen garments bear the god on a ceremonial barge or chariot. Incense smoke thickens the air. Drums sound in measured rhythm. The population lines the processional way, pressing against the glazed walls, watching the god pass between the striding lions. At the Akitu house, rituals determine the destinies for the coming year. The gods assemble, their statues brought from other Mesopotamian cities gathered in Babylon as subordinates to Marduk. This is theology expressed as urban geography. Every city that sends its god's statue to Babylon acknowledges Marduk's supremacy and Babylon's centrality. The procession returns. Marduk re-enters the Esagila. The cycle closes. the world is made new for another year. The canals still flow, the kilns still burn. The astronomical observers on the ziggurats' upper stages record the positions of the planets with a precision that Greek astronomers will later inherit. Babylon's sacred geography is not decoration layered onto a political capital. It is the reason the capital exists, the conviction built into every glazed brick and limestone slab that this city is where the universe holds together. But the sacred geography serves a city of living bodies. Beyond the processional way, beyond the temple precincts and palace walls, Babylon breathes through its residential quarters, dense, mud-brick, human-scaled neighborhoods where perhaps 150,000 people wake each morning to the sound of donkeys, grinding stones, and water splashing into courtyard basins. The district the excavators call Merkez lies east of the processional way, and its stratigraphy preserves centuries of continuous habitation. Houses here follow a pattern ancient to Mesopotamia, rooms arranged around a central courtyard open to the sky. The courtyard is everything: lightwell, kitchen, workshop, social space. Walls of sun-dried mud brick rise 2 stories in wealthier homes, plastered smooth inside, whitewashed against the heat. Doorways are narrow, streets narrower still, sometimes barely wide enough for 2 people to pass. Drainage channels run beneath the packed earth lanes, carrying wastewater towards the canals. The smell is perpetual: cooking oil, animal dung used as fuel, the yeasty warmth of fermenting grain. Beer is not luxury here. It is daily sustenance, safer than canal water, brewed in nearly every household and in dedicated production facilities. Barley is malted, mixed with bapir, a twice-baked bread, and fermented in large ceramic vessels sealed with clay stoppers. Ration texts from temple and palace archives record beer allocations by the liter, distributed to workers, priests, and slaves alike. The brewing vessels recovered from Merkez bear the residue of this ancient staple, their interiors stained dark by generations of fermentation. Textile production fills the hours of women and enslaved workers. Loom weights of fired clay appear in almost every domestic context. Wool from temple flocks and privately owned sheep is carded, spun on hand spindles, and woven into fabric that serves both as clothing and as currency. Contracts specify textile deliveries measured by weight and quality. A household's loom is an economic engine. In the scribal schools, the Eduba tradition inherited from Sumer, young men press reed styluses into damp clay, copying sign lists, mathematical tables, and literary compositions. Practice tablets recovered from residential contexts show the progression. First individual wedge marks, then syllables, then proverbs, then excerpts from the Epic of Gilgamesh. Errors are smoothed over and rewritten. The finished scribe enters temple administration, palace bureaucracy, or private commercial life, drafting the contracts that govern every transaction in this city built on recorded obligation. Marriage contracts specify dowry, divorce terms, and inheritance rights. Debt tablets record loans of silver and barley at fixed interest. Slave sale documents note the seller's guarantee against prior claims. Death brings division of property according to written will or customary law. Sons inherit, daughters receive dowries, and the family house passes to the eldest, or is divided by agreement recorded in clay. Above the rooftops, on the upper stages of Etemenanke, and on dedicated observation platforms, the astronomers work through every clear night. They record the rising and setting of Venus, the movements of Jupiter and Saturn, lunar eclipses timed to the water clock's precision. Their diaries, continuous from at least the mid-7th century before the Common Era, constitute the longest unbroken astronomical record in human history. These observations serve omen literature and temple ritual, but they also accumulate into mathematical models of planetary periodicity that later Greek astronomers will adopt and refine. This is the city beneath the monuments. Not the Ishtar Gate splendor, but the courtyard where a woman grinds sesame for oil. Not the processional way's limestone slabs, but the packed earth alley where a scribe carries fresh tablets to the archive. Not Marduk's golden throne, but the ceramic jar where barley ferments in the dark. Babylon's greatness is not only vertical, the ziggurat, the walls, the glazed facades. It is horizontal, spreading through thousands of households whose daily rhythms of labor, worship, commerce, and rest sustain the engine that makes the monuments possible. The city holds together not by royal decree alone, but by the accumulated weight of ordinary lives recorded in clay, sealed in jars, woven into cloth, and measured against the stars. And all of those ordinary lives depend on exchange. The courtyard where sesame is ground, the workshop where linen is woven, the brewery where barley ferments, none of these exist in isolation. They are nodes in a commercial web that stretches from the marshes of the Persian Gulf to the cedar forests of Lebanon, from the tin mines of the Iranian plateau to the copper sources of Cyprus. Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar and his successors is not merely the political center of an empire. It is the greatest marketplace in the ancient world. The Euphrates itself is the city's primary artery of commerce. Rafts of inflated goatskins carry loads downstream from the upper country, timber, stone, wine, metals that the alluvial plain cannot produce. At the quays along Babylon's western bank, these rafts are disassembled, their cargo transferred to warehouses built of fired brick, their skins deflated and loaded onto donkeys for the return journey upstream. The river moves in one direction for heavy goods, the road moves in the other for merchants returning to buy again. Canals multiply the river's reach. The Aratu Channel passes through the city's heart, and smaller waterways connect Babylon to Borsippa, Kish, Sippar, and ultimately to the network that links the Euphrates to the Tigris. Barges carry dates by the tens of thousands of bushels, the staple sweetener, the fermentation base, the export crop that defines southern Mesopotamian agriculture. Grain moves in similar volumes. Temple and palace archives record shipments measured in kuru, each roughly 150 liters, flowing between institutional storehouses and redistribution centers. But Babylon's commerce is not only institutional. Private merchant families operate across generations, accumulating wealth in silver, land, and commercial contracts. The Egyibi family archive, over 1,700 cuneiform tablets spanning 5 generations from the reign of Nebuchadnezzar through the early Persian period, reveals a dynasty of entrepreneurs engaged in money lending, real estate, slave trading, tax farming, and canal management. They extend credit in weighed silver, collect interest at standard rates of 20% per annum, and hold land as collateral. Their transactions touch every sector of the urban economy. Silver functions as the universal measure of value. It is not coined, not yet, but weighed in shekels and minas on standardized balance stones. A shekel of silver buys roughly 1 kuru of barley in stable years, though prices fluctuate with harvest and war. The astronomical diaries that Babylonian scholars maintain include commodity price observations alongside celestial data, creating an unbroken economic record that modern historians mine for evidence of ancient market behavior. Textiles rank among the most valuable trade goods. Wool from the flocks pastured along the empire's margins enters the city raw and leaves as finished garments dyed with madder, pomegranate rind, and imported indigo. Linen from Egyptian or local flax supplements the wool trade. These fabrics travel westward along caravan routes through Tadmor and onward to Phoenician ports, where they enter Mediterranean exchange networks. Metals arrive from every direction. Copper from Oman and Dilmun, tin from sources east of the Zagros, iron increasingly common though still expensive, gold from Egypt and Nubia moving through intermediary traders. The palace workshops consume these metals for weapons, ritual vessels, and architectural fittings. The temples demand gold leaf for divine statues and lapis lazuli from the mountains of Badakhshan for sacred adornment. The infrastructure that supports this commerce is itself monumental. Bridges span the Euphrates. Herodotus describes one of stone piers with removable wooden decking. Warehouses cluster near the river gates. Cylinder seals pressed into clay bully authenticate shipments and contracts, each seal a miniature work of art identifying its owner across the literate commercial world. This is the engine beneath the empire's glory. Every glazed brick on the Ishtar Gate, every gold fitting in Esagila, every ration distributed to laborers on royal building projects, flows from the surplus generated by trade, agriculture, and the financial instruments that connect them. Babylon's walls protect not only a population, but a market. And it is the market, as much as the army, that holds the empire together. Nebuchadnezzar II dies in 562 before the Common Era, and the greatest city on earth holds its breath. The walls still stand. The Ishtar Gate still blazes blue under the Mesopotamian sun. The markets still hum. The temples still burn incense. The astronomical diaries still record the movements of Jupiter and Venus with meticulous precision. But the hand that built all of this is gone, and what follows is a succession crisis that will hollow the empire from within. His son Amel-Marduk takes the throne. The biblical tradition remembers him as Evil Merodach, the king who released Jehoiakim of Judah from prison. But the Babylonian priesthood and military elite regard him with suspicion. Within 2 years he is dead, murdered in a palace coup led by his brother-in-law Neriglissar, a military commander who had served under Nebuchadnezzar during the siege of Jerusalem. Neriglissar rules for 4 years, campaigns briefly in Cilicia, and dies of natural causes. His young son Labashi-Marduk sits on the throne for barely 2 months before conspirators remove him. 3 kings in 7 years. The southern palace, with its glazed throne room and cedar-beamed halls, becomes a place of whispered alliances and sudden violence. In 556 before the Common Era, the conspirators elevate Nabonidus, a man of obscure origin, possibly from Haran in Upper Mesopotamia, certainly devoted to the moon god Sin with a fervor that unsettles the Marduk priesthood. His mother Adad-Gupi served as a priestess of Sin at Haran, and her influence shapes his theology. From the beginning, Nabonidus is a king at odds with his own capital. He undertakes restorations of Sin's temple at Haran and at Ur, lavishing attention on sanctuaries far from Babylon. The priests of Esagila watch with growing unease as royal patronage shifts away from Marduk. Then Nabonidus does something unprecedented. Around 550 before the Common Era, he departs Babylon for the Arabian oasis of Taima, deep in the desert of the Hejaz, and he stays there for approximately 10 years. The reasons remain debated: trade ambitions along the Arabian incense routes, religious visions, political exile self-imposed or forced. Inscriptions at Taima show he builds a palace there, establishes a court, lives as though Taima were his capital. He leaves his son Belshazzar in Babylon as regent. The consequences are devastating for the city's sacred identity. The Akitu festival, the great New Year celebration that renews the cosmic order, requires the king's physical presence. Without the king, the ritual cannot be performed. Year after year, the Nabonidus Chronicle records the same grim notation. The festival did not take place. The golden statue of Marduk sits in Esagila, without its annual procession down the limestone-paved avenue. The sacred marriage goes unconsummated. The cycle of renewal that binds heaven and earth through Babylon's streets falls silent. The verse account of Nabonidus, a propagandistic text likely composed after his fall, portrays him as a madman and a heretic, a king who ignored the supreme god, neglected the temples, burdened the people with forced labor on distant projects, and failed to understand the sacred tablets. The text drips with priestly contempt. Whether its accusations are fair matters less than what they reveal, the Marduk clergy has turned against its own king. The institutional heart of Babylon, the temple economy that manages vast agricultural estates, employs thousands, and anchors civic identity, is alienated from the throne. Nabonidus eventually returns to Babylon, perhaps around 543 before the Common Era. He attempts to gather the cult statues of outlying cities into the capital, as though concentrating divine power behind the walls. But this act alarms rather than reassures. Provincial priests see their gods taken hostage. The empire's spiritual fabric frays at every edge. The walls remain immense, the granaries remain full, the Euphrates still flows through the city's heart, but the covenant between king and god, between palace and temple, between Babylon and the cosmic order it claims to sustain, that covenant is broken. And to the east, beyond the Zagros Mountains, Cyrus of Persia is assembling the largest army the ancient world has yet seen. In 539 before the Common Era, Cyrus II of Persia crosses the Tigris with an army drawn from every corner of his expanding dominion. Medes, Persians, Elamites, levies from the Iranian plateau and the eastern steppes, a coalition unprecedented in scale, moving west across Mesopotamia with the discipline of veterans and the confidence of those who have never lost. Nabonidus marches north to meet them. The armies collide at Opis, on the Tigris roughly 80 kilometers upstream from Babylon. The Babylonian line breaks. The chroniclers record that the Persian forces slaughtered the defenders, that the river ran red, that panic swept through the survivors. Nabonidus flees south. The northern cities, Sippar, Borsippa, open their gates without resistance. The Persian advance becomes a procession. On the 16th day of Tishri, in October of 539, the Persian general Ugbaru enters Babylon. No siege engines batter the double walls. No fire consumes the Ishtar Gate. The city surrenders. Greek historians, writing generations later, will insist that Cyrus diverted the Euphrates and that his soldiers waded into the city through the exposed riverbed beneath the walls. Herodotus's account, dramatic and debated. The Babylonian chronicles record no such engineering feat. They report only that the city was taken without battle, that the sanctuaries were undisturbed, that daily life continued uninterrupted. The difference between the accounts is the difference between myth and administrative record, between what a conqueror wishes posterity to believe and what the temple scribes saw from their windows. Cyrus himself enters Babylon 2 weeks later, on the 3rd of Marcheshvan. He rides down the processional way not as a destroyer, but as a liberator. The Marduk priesthood, alienated by Nabonidus's devotion to sin, greets the Persian king as the chosen of their god. Cyrus orders the cult statues Nabonidus had gathered into the capital returned to their home sanctuaries. He restores the interrupted festivals. He commissions a clay cylinder, baked and inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform, declaring that Marduk himself had searched the lands for a righteous ruler and had chosen Cyrus, king of Anshan, to restore order to Babylon. The cylinder, buried in the foundations of the city wall, proclaims peace, the end of forced labor, the protection of the sacred precincts. Babylon does not fall. It changes hands. The walls still stand. The ziggurat still rises above the rooftops. The Euphrates still flows between the embankments. But the throne is now occupied by a foreigner who speaks Persian, who venerates Ahura Mazda, and who rules from Susa and Ecbatana as often as from Babylon. The city becomes a provincial capital within the largest empire the world has yet seen, prosperous, populated, still sacred, but no longer sovereign. The processional way, built for Babylonian kings, now echoes with the footsteps of Persian soldiers. The city that ruled Mesopotamia for over a millennium becomes a jewel in someone else's crown. 2 centuries pass under Persian rule. Babylon remains vast, still populous, still sacred, but governed from afar. The Achaemenid kings visit for coronations and festivals, maintain the temples, collect tribute. The city functions, but it no longer commands. Then in 331 before the Common Era, the world shifts again. Alexander of Macedon defeats Darius III at Gaugamela in October, and within weeks his army marches south across the Mesopotamian plain toward the greatest city most of his soldiers have ever imagined. The Babylonian astronomical diaries, clay tablets recording celestial observations alongside earthly events, note his arrival with characteristic precision. The satrap Mazaeus surrenders the city without resistance. The gates open. Macedonian cavalry rides down the processional way, past the glazed bulls and dragons of the Ishtar Gate, between walls that dwarf anything in the Greek world. Alexander enters not as a destroyer, but as a liberator, or so the priests of Marduk choose to frame it. He sacrifices at the Esagila temple according to their instructions. He orders the restoration of sanctuaries that Persian neglect has allowed to decay. Most ambitiously, he commands the clearing of Etemenanki, the great ziggurat, which by this time has partially collapsed into its own rubble. 10,000 men are reportedly set to work removing debris from the enormous base, 91 meters on each side. The project stalls. The sheer volume of degraded mud brick overwhelms even Macedonian logistics. The ziggurat, already ancient beyond reckoning, resists resurrection. For 8 years Alexander campaigns eastward into Bactria, Sogdiana, the Indus Valley, and Babylon waits. When he returns in 323 before the Common Era, he enters the southern palace, and makes the city his imperial capital. Plans multiply: a fleet for Arabian exploration, a harbor basin on the Euphrates large enough for 1,000 warships, the completion of Etemenanke. Babylon is to become the center of a world empire stretching from Libya to the Punjab. On the 10th or 11th of June, 323 before the Common Era, Alexander dies in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar. He is 32 years old. The astronomical diary records the date, the location, the silence that follows. The grandest plans ever conceived for Babylon die with him in those mud-brick halls. What follows is partition, war, and slow drainage. The generals divide the empire. Seleucus, who claims Mesopotamia, initially governs from Babylon. But around 305 before the Common Era, he founds a new capital, Seleucia on the Tigris, 60 kilometers to the northeast, positioned on the river that increasingly carries the region's commerce. The logic is brutal and simple. The Tigris offers better access to eastern trade routes, and a new city can be planned from scratch without the weight of ancient priesthoods and crumbling infrastructure. The population begins to leave, not in a single exodus, but in a generation-long trickle. Merchants relocate to where the new markets form. Craftsmen follow the court. Scholars carry their tablets to new libraries. The astronomical observers remain longest. Their diaries continue recording eclipses and planetary movements from Babylon's temples well into the Seleucid period, maintaining an unbroken tradition stretching back centuries. But the streets thin. Residential quarters in the Merkez district show declining occupation in Seleucid-era strata. Houses are abandoned, walls collapse inward, courtyards fill with wind-blown dust. A Greek theatre is built near the processional way, a small concession to the new culture, but it serves a shrinking audience. The Esagila temple still functions, priests still perform rituals, but the city around it contracts like a body losing warmth from its extremities inward. By 275 before the Common Era, Babylon is no longer a capital of anything. It is a temple town, a relic, a place where old rites persist amid emptying neighborhoods. The walls that once enclosed the largest city on earth now ring silence. The ziggurat remains half buried in its own debris, Alexander's clearance project abandoned where his workers left it. The Euphrates, never fully maintained, shifts its channels. Canals silt up. The infrastructure that sustained hundreds of thousands begins its long failure. The city that survived Hittite fire, Assyrian fury, and Persian conquest cannot survive irrelevance. And so, the long silence begins. Through the 3rd century before the Common Era, a Parthian-era village settles over the northeastern ruins. Modest mud-brick houses built directly atop the rubble of Nebuchadnezzar's palaces. Farmers and herders occupy what was once the administrative heart of an empire. They dig their foundations into destruction layers centuries deep, unknowingly cutting through glazed brick and bitumen mortar to plant their walls in older walls. A small Greek-style theatre rises near the remains of the processional way, serving a diminished community that still remembers, dimly, that this ground once mattered. The Esagila temple complex endures longest. Priests still copy astronomical observations onto clay tablets, maintaining a tradition stretching back more than 1,000 years. The last datable cuneiform text from Babylon, an astronomical almanac, belongs to approximately 75 of the Common Era. After that, nothing. The reed stylus presses into wet clay for the final time, and the oldest continuous writing tradition in human history falls silent in the very city that perfected it. No conquest ends it, no fire. Simply the last scribe dies or departs, and no student follows. The Euphrates continues its slow migration westward, abandoning the channels that once bisected the city. Without maintenance, the great canals that Nebuchadnezzar dredged and lined with baked brick fill with sediment. Date palms die. Fields revert to salt-crusted waste. The alluvial plain, which built Babylon with its fertility, now buries it with its floods. Each spring, the river deposits fine silt across the ruins. Wind-blown sand from the western desert adds its own slow accumulation. Century by century, the walls sink. The Ishtar Gate, once towering 14 meters above the processional way, disappears beneath rising ground. Etemenanke's massive platform, 91 meters on each side, becomes an irregular mound indistinguishable from the natural terrain. The city that once held perhaps 200,000 souls becomes a landscape of low tells and eroded ridges, trackless and silent under the Mesopotamian sun. Centuries pass with almost no written record of the site. Then, in the 1160s of the Common Era, the Jewish traveller Benjamin of Tudela passes through the region and notes ruins he associates with the ancient city, describing remnants of what he believes is the palace of Nebuchadnezzar. His account is brief, almost casual, a few lines in a longer itinerary. Other medieval travellers mention the name, but none linger. The ruins offer nothing visible to untrained eyes. No standing columns, no carved facades, only endless mud-brick mounds dissolving back into the earth from which they were formed. European interest stirs slowly. By the 17th and 18th centuries, travellers and merchants pass near the site, speculating about which mounds correspond to the biblical city. Pietro della Valle visits in 1616 and carries away inscribed bricks, the first Babylonian artifacts to reach Europe. But systematic observation waits nearly 2 more centuries. In 1811, Claudius James Rich, the British resident in Baghdad, rides out to the mounds with measuring chains, a compass, and a sketchbook. Over several visits, he surveys the visible remains. The massive northern mound the locals call Babil, the central ruin field of Qasr, the lower southern tells. He measures, sketches, and collects inscribed bricks and cylinder fragments. His published work, Memoir on the Ruins of Babylon, provides the first measured plan of the site and confirms to European scholarship that these mounds are indeed the remains of the ancient city. Rich's careful drawings show a landscape of eroded ridges and shallow depressions where canals once ran, a topography that only excavation will decode. The memoir circulates through learned societies in London and Paris. It sparks debate, curiosity, and the first serious proposals for excavation. But the mounds keep their secrets a while longer, baked hard under the sun, holding within them glazed dragons and golden foundations, and the floor where Alexander breathed his last. The city waits beneath the plain, patient as the clay from which it was made. On the 26th of March, 1899, a German architect named Robert Koldewey drives the first spade into the mound called Qasr, the castle mound, and Babylon begins its slow return from the earth. Koldewey is not a treasure hunter. He is methodical, patient, trained in stratigraphy. He has visited this site 3 years earlier and noticed fragments of glazed brick glinting in the eroded surface, blue, turquoise, gold, molded into the muscled flanks of animals. He knows what lies beneath. The excavation will last 18 years. Koldewey's team, numbering at times over 200 local workers, cuts systematic trenches through millennia of compacted fill. Within months, the processional way emerges, its limestone slabs still fitted tight, its walls rising in courses of glazed brick, bearing 60 golden lions in low relief, striding in eternal procession toward a gate that has not been seen by human eyes in 2,000 years. And then the gate itself, the Ishtar Gate, its facade encrusted with rows of Mushkushshu dragons and aurochs bulls moulded in polychrome glaze against a field of lapis blue. The bricks are numbered, catalogued, crated. Hundreds of fragments are shipped to Berlin. Koldewey's notebooks record the Southern Palace throne room with its glazed floral friezes, the foundations of the Esagila temple, the massive footprint of Etemenanki, 91 meters on each side, confirming the Esagila tablet's ancient measurements. He maps residential quarters, drainage systems, streets that match cuneiform building inscriptions. His published volumes, The Excavations at Babylon, become the foundational texts of Mesopotamian urban archaeology. For the first time, the city described by Herodotus and the Hebrew prophets stands verified in mud brick and bitumen. In Berlin, the reconstruction begins. The Ishtar Gate rises again inside the Pergamon Museum, assembled from original glazed bricks supplemented by careful restorations. It opens to the public in 1930 and remains one of the most visited ancient monuments in Europe, a fragment of Nebuchadnezzar's city standing under a German roof, thousands of kilometers from the Euphrates. At the original site, the 20th century brings turbulence. During the 1980s, reconstruction projects raise new walls atop ancient foundations, stamping modern bricks with contemporary inscriptions in imitation of Nebuchadnezzar's practice. The work is controversial. Archaeologists warn that new construction compresses and obscures original strata. Military activity in 2003 causes further damage, with trenches and earthworks cut into archaeological zones. Yet the site endures, as it has always endured. In 2019, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization inscribes Babylon as a World Heritage Site, recognizing not only the ruins but the cultural landscape surrounding them, the canals, the tells, the layers of continuous human presence stretching back 5 millennia. What Babylon gave to the world outlasts every wall. The concept of codified law, written and displayed for public knowledge. The elevation of astronomical observation into systematic science. The Babylonian astronomical diaries span centuries and form the longest continuous scientific record of the ancient world. The idea that a city could be more than a fortress or a market, that it could be a sacred cosmos in miniature, its temples aligned to the heavens, its festivals binding human time to divine order. The 60-minute hour, the 360-degree circle, the mathematical systems that underpin navigation and timekeeping to this day, all carry Babylonian fingerprints. The ruins stand today on the alluvial plain, low and sun-bleached, crossed by modern roads and bordered by palm groves. The Euphrates has shifted its course. The glazed dragons are in Berlin. The golden statue of Marduk has never been found. But the ground holds its memory in fired brick and cuneiform, in bitumen seals and foundation cylinders, in the geometry of streets that once held the largest population on earth. Babylon does not need to be rebuilt. It needs only to be remembered, and the clay, patient as ever, keeps the record. Thank you for walking through these ancient streets across every chapter of this journey. If these stories of the deep past have moved you, consider subscribing so you will not miss the next city we bring back from the silence of the centuries.